when I was sitting in a humid, sand-caked tent in the Middle East, listening to the distant rhythm of mortar fire. The only thing that kept my head straight was the thought of the Blackwood Ridge, 1,500 acres of the most stubborn, beautiful land in North Texas that had been in my family since the late 1800s. I could almost smell the damp cedar and the way the wind whistles through the canyon when a storm is rolling in, and I promised myself that if I made it back in one piece, I'd never leave those gates again, but life has a funny way of kicking you when you're already down. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my family's ranch after 24 hours of travel, still wearing my dusty fatigues and carrying a duffel bag full of ghosts, only to find a bright orange in quote, private property in quote, sign bolted to my grandfather's hand-carved gate. It wasn't and oppos. T just a sign. It was a declaration of war, and standing right there on the porch of the house where I learned to walk was a woman named Regina Vance, looking like she'd stepped out of a high-end real estate catalog with a smile that felt like a razor blade wrapped in silk. She didn't in oppos. T asked how the war was. She didn't in oppos. T thanked me for my service. She just tapped her clipboard and told me that the Blackwood Ridge Homeowners Association had acquired the eastern 1,000 acres of my ranch through a tax lien sale while I was dodging bullets 3,000 miles away. That ranch was my soul. It was where my father taught me how to brand cattle and where we buried my grandfather, a man who survived the Great Depression and a world war only to have his legacy sold for pennies on the dollar by a woman who measured the height of her neighbors in oppos, grass with a literal ruler. Regina looked at my uniform with this patronizing pity, telling me that the county had sent notices that obviously went to a mailbox I couldn't and oppos. T-check in a combat zone. And since the end quote, delinquent in quote, taxes wearing in oppos. T paid, the HOA had stepped into in quote, save the neighborhood and oppos. S aesthetic integrity in quote, by planning a 50-home luxury development right over my family's grazing pastures. I stood there, my blood turning to ice, looking past her at the surveyors already driving stakes into the ground near the old cemetery, where the headstones were starting to disappear under piles of construction debris, and I realized right then that the battlefield had an end oppos. T ended at the border. It had just followed me home. Regina leaned in, smelling of expensive perfume and entitlement, and whispered that and quote, disturbed veteran in quote, with a history of combat stress, probably shooting into oppos. T be making a scene in a quiet community, implying that if I didn't into oppos, T walk away quietly. She'd make sure the sheriff, who happened to be her brother-in-law, found a reason to keep me in a cell until the bulldozers finished their job. I spent the next 3 days in a cheap motel room with a flickering neon sign, staring at my bank account, which had been drained to nearly nothing by a messy divorce and legal fees from a previous dispute, leaving me with exactly $312 to my name. I felt small, I felt defeated, and for a second, I actually thought about just taking the meager in quote, relocation fee in quote, they offered and disappearing into the hills. But then I remembered the way my grandfather used to look at that land, like it was a living, breathing thing that demanded respect. I remembered his old leather-bound journals kept in a fireproof safe in the barn. And since the HOA hadn't and oppos, T managed to break into the heavy outbuildings yet. I snuck onto my own property under the cover of a Texas thunderstorm, moving like the scout I was trained to be. I spent hours in that barn, the rain drumming on the tin roof, digging through yellowed blueprints and deeds from the 1950s until I found a dusty, red-ribbon folder that changed the entire trajectory of my life. My grandfather wasn't in oppos. T was just a rancher. He was a man who planned for every contingency, and back in 1961, when the surrounding town started creeping closer, he did something incredibly brilliant and incredibly quiet. He sold the surface rights to the adjacent parcels but retained 100% of the subsurface mineral and structural support rights for the entire valley. See, in Texas, property law can be a tangled mess of layers, and what Regina and her high-priced developers didn't in oppos, T realized was that they had bought the in quote, skin in quote, of the earth, but I still owned the in quote, bones in quote. Every luxury mansion they were building, every swimming pool they were digging, and every foundation they were pouring was technically resting on property that belonged to me, and under a specific archaic clause in the original deed, the subsurface owner held the dominant estate. meaning the surface owner couldn't and oppose T do anything that interfered with the subsurface owner's right to access their property. I called up an old friend from my unit, a guy named Silas who had traded his rifle for a law degree and specialized in property litigation, and when I told him what I had, I could hear him laughing through the phone for 3 straight minutes. He told me, and quote, "Elias, you don't oppose. T just have a case, you have a nuclear weapon, and Regina Vance just built her throne on top of your silo." End quote. We didn't oppose. T move right away because military intelligence teaches you that timing is everything. So I let them keep building, watching through binoculars for my remaining 500 acres as they poured millions of dollars into marble countertops, infinity pools, and gated entrances. I watched Regina host, and quote, Founders Day, and quote, parties where she'd brag about, and quote, cleaning up the area, and quote, all while I was living on canned beans and sleeping on a cot, documenting every single violation of environmental law they committed during construction. They were dumping silt into the creek that fed the local lake, they were ignoring drainage requirements, and they were treating the old family cemetery like a trash heap, but I just waited, letting their investment grow until it reached the point of no return. The day the first 10 houses hit the market for $3 million apiece, I had Silas serve the HOA, the developers, and every title insurance company in the state with a formal, and quote, notice of subsurface encroachment and intent to exercise mineral access, end quote. The look on Regina's face when she marched up to my porch a day later was worth more than any paycheck I'd ever received. She was trembling with rage, waving the papers in the air and screaming that I was and quote, bottom-feeding extortionist, end quote, who was trying to ruin the lives of 50 innocent families. I just sat there in a rocking chair, sipping lukewarm coffee, and told her that I wasn't oppose to ruining anything. I was just planning on starting a very large-scale, very loud, and very deep vertical mining operation directly underneath her new community's clubhouse. Silas had found that because I owned the structural support rights, I could legally demand that they, end quote, vacate the vertical space, end quote, or pay a licensing fee that was essentially the entire value of the homes, plus damages for the desecration of the cemetery. The title companies realized they had missed a massive cloud on the title, and suddenly, the bank stopped funding the project, the contractors walked off the job, and those 50 families who had put down deposits started realizing their, quote, dream homes, and quote, were built on a legal sinkhole. Regina tried to fight back with everything she had, using her connections to have the county inspector harass me, and even trying to get a judge to declare me, end quote, mentally unfit, end quote, to hold property, but the community started to turn on her when they found out she had been skimming money from the HOA dues to pay for her own, end quote, consulting fees, end quote. I started holding town hall meetings at the local VFW, showing the neighbors the evidence of how she'd forged the tax liens and how she'd planned to flip the land for a massive personal profit, and slowly, the people she thought were her subjects became her biggest enemies. An old lady named Mrs. Gable, who had lived in the area for 40 years, came forward with emails showing Regina had threatened to foreclose on her house over a birdhouse that was, in quote, the wrong shade of blue, end quote, and that was the spark that turned the neighborhood into a powder keg. The climax came on a blistering Tuesday afternoon when the state investigators showed up at the HOA office with a search warrant for the financial records, and Regina was caught trying to shred documents in the back room, while her white Mercedes was idling in the parking lot, packed with suitcases and offshore bank account information. I stood at the edge of the property line, watching the handcuffs click shut on her wrists, and she looked at me with this hollow, defeated stare, the mask of the perfect suburban queen finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. She didn't oppose to have anything to say then, no more witty insults or threats, just the sound of the wind blowing through the Blackwood Ridge, finally free of the noise of construction. In the end, I didn't oppose to just get my land back. I ended up owning the entire development through a massive settlement that the insurance companies paid out just to make the lawsuit go away. I didn't oppose to tear the houses down, though. I turned the completed ones into a retreat for veterans and their families, a place where guys coming back from where I was could find a little peace and quiet without someone measuring their grass or judging their scars. The cemetery has a new iron fence now, and the roses are blooming again, thicker than they've been in years, but sometimes I still sit on that porch and wonder how many other people are losing their legacies to someone with a clipboard and a lack of a soul. It makes you think about what, in quote, ownership, in quote, really means in this country, and whether we ever really own anything, or if we're just placeholders until someone greedier comes along. I'm curious, though. If you came home and found your family's history mark for sale, how far would you go to protect it? Is there a line you would and oppose, T-cross, or is justice worth any price, even if it means burning the whole neighborhood down to save the dirt beneath it? Drop a comment and let me know, because I'm still trying to figure out if I'm the hero of this story or just a man who knew where the bones were buried.